The trouble for me with introducing Gary Paul Nabhan is I'm never quite sure which Gary Nabhan I should introduce. Whether I should be talking about the scientist and pollination biologist who has been given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Society for Conservation Biology and is currently a research scientist at the University of Arizona. The writer who has authored more than 24 books and received a John Burroughs Nature Writing Award. The visionary who was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. The activist who founded a series of organizations to advocate for food, farmers, and communities, including native seeds, graft, and flavors without borders. Or the mystic who I saw reading Thomas Merton on his roof before dawn. But what I can say is why I wanted to bring Gary here at this moment in time, which is that I believe Gary models the kind of long-term hard work that's required for cultural and ecological survival. For those of us who care about both food and justice, who care about both people and the environment, who are seeking practices and ways to build coalitions around these issues, Gary's enduring friendships and cross-disciplinary work is an inspiration. So I'm very glad to introduce Dr. Gary Paul Nabhan, and native son of the Rust Belt. He's from Gary, Indiana. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I too want to thank Janet and all her wonderful students and associates, particularly Ted, for just the hospitality that I've received the last few days and the wonderful insight into local projects and the wonderful collegial discussion of things that I think we all care about. About a year and a half ago, when I came back to the University of Arizona in the stinking hot desert after being up by the Grand Canyon for a decade, I really wanted to do sort of a shift in what I'd been working on and who I'd been working with, to focus more on not the heritage foods of North America as a static entity, but understand them in terms of the dynamism, the incredible change that's happening in our food system, in part driven by factors like the economic downturn and climate change, environmental degradation, but also the positive social change that we're seeing associated with the food justice movement. And it was inspired, I was inspired by people like David Orr and by your speaker next week, Bill McKibben, to really look deeper at how climate change is affecting the future sustainability of agriculture, not just documenting the richness of the past. So to some extent, the bottom line of this whole talk is that third line of the title, that there's a need to redesign our food systems to be more resilient, adaptive, and sustainable. And you all are the co-designers of those systems. We either do that by default by letting Monsanto and Cargill and Cisco and the American Farm Bureau and the USDA design them, or we do that actively by saying those partners probably have some legitimate role in this, but all of the rest of us do as eaters and part-time food producers and citizens of this world. And either we take charge for redesigning those food systems so that they're just, safe, equitable, and resilient, or they may be designed in a way that doesn't achieve all those goals. So I hope by the end of this talk you feel empowered, not depressed by the apocalyptic signs of agricultural collapse that some people read into climate change, but that you're more engaged to want to make some positive changes in the face of the climate change that's already going on. So let me just make a connection for you that is embedded in all the other things I'll be saying. But climate change affects food security and food justice in a very direct way, as the cost of climatic events become accounted for in the food system and food prices go up, some of that food is immediately put out of the hands, out of the reach of the poor. We've seen more Americans using food stamps and food banks, the SNAP program, where people can buy fresh food through farmers markets even, than ever before in American history. Where I live in Arizona, we have more people food insecure than ever before. Even during the Depression, we're now just above Mississippi in poverty. Our increases in poverty since the economic downturn have been fourfold the national average of poverty increases. And Arizona and New Mexico, the Southwest that I've dedicated most of my work to, we're now in the lowest rungs of the ladder in dealing with food insecurity of people. So many people are now finding hard just to, I think it's 50% of Arizonans and New Mexicans are saying it's hard to put the food on the table that they wish to feed their families. They have that goal, but they're feeling compromises in gaining access to affordable, nutritious food. So as I learned of these impacts, I wanted to understand what people in the field, from farmers to chefs to eaters, were saying about them. And so I went on a space odyssey, a spice odyssey, with two friends, what we call the spice ship. Imagine a big hot air balloon in the shape of a chili pepper that you rode around with two of your best friends in, and while you were riding around in this hot chili pepper balloon, you looked for signs in the landscape that recent change had happened, either due to floods or drought or hurricanes or tropical storms. And then you went down to investigate those. Well, amazingly, what Craig Kraft, this agroecologist who now lives in Nicaragua, and Kurt Fries from Iowa and I were able to do was pretty much similar to that, except sometimes we used a rental car or hiked into a place rather than using a big hot air balloon to get there. But it was to really hear what people in each region that has a long tradition of place-based food traditions are saying about how climate change is affecting those food traditions. Climate change among many other drivers of change. So we weren't asking them about climate change per se, but all the many factors that are affecting their food system and the health and well-being of their communities. And then to relate that not only to the natural causes and effects, but the cultural issues associated with it. And I should say that I come to this work in a very biased way rather than an unbiased way. I try to have my science objective as possible once I start it, but what I choose to study is based on what I love. And I love chili peppers. And I ate them constantly on this trip, and my body is made of chili peppers, so chili peppers, not a human being, will be speaking to you. So I'm going to use a word over and over again, and I might as well talk a little bit about it first. I'm particularly interested not in the food system in general, but certain canaries in the coal mine that I think tell us a lot about how food biodiversity may be affected by climate change, and that food biodiversity is our major way of dealing with food security in a time of uncertainty. And that's that there's certain foods that have a long history of adaptation to the soils, climate, and even to the cultures and culinary traditions of particular places. It's what we typically call heirloom vegetables, even though now we have some heirloom vegetables like Cherokee purple tomato or Trail of Tears bean or Moon and Stars tomato that you can find coast to coast in restaurants and all of that. That after hundreds of years of being place-based, they're sort of commoditized and globalized. What I'm really talking about is the heirloom seeds and heritage breeds that have long been attached to a particular locality with a climate that it's adapted to, possibly ecological adaptations to the soil, resistance to some of the pests and diseases of that are endemic in that place, and then a long, strong relationship with particular cultural and culinary traditions, sometimes a single culture, sometimes multiple cultures in one place. And the Moritz Mountain Orchard in Appalachia and near Boone, North Carolina, is a good example of that. Some of the apples that Bill Moritz is growing for his apple CSA, where people get a delivery of 12 kinds of apples every week, are actually seedling apples that they found on the farm out in the hedgerows that, you know, the squirrels or someone else deposited there from an apple that was probably a hybrid of two of the old heirlooms, and it came up and it was a new apple. And they selected that tree and then grafted it onto other rootstock and have kept it in their orchard. The variety literally grew up on their place. And there's about 800 some unique heirloom apples in Appalachia. I'll be talking about that in a minute. But the point is that these things have long ties. That was a seedling apple that occurred when Bill's grandfather, great-grandfather owned the place. And he's still growing it there and making it locally available to residents and to consumers. Curiously, you live in this wonderful ecotone between two food sheds or food regions, Appalachia and the Great Lakes. And there are so many foods here, both immigrant and native, from the eight-road corns that came into this area about 1,500 years ago to the apple varieties that came in with weird dudes like Johnny Appleseed 150 years ago or whenever it was, that occur nowhere else in North America. They're unique to this place. People may be able to now get them off the internet, but historically they were largely passed around through the nurserymen and seedsmen of a particular region. That we've lost about 450 independently owned nurseries in this country in the last 15 years. But those guys could tell you, well, if you're living in Oberlin, I wouldn't recommend the same apples that I'd recommend to you if you lived in Upper Sandusky or in Akron, because you're in a particular microclimate, so try these things here. So that's incredibly interesting local knowledge expressed through the food system that we're kind of losing now. And so we've done surveys of the different regions of the country to see how many of these things are still around. And the amazing thing that we've recently published is that Appalachia as a region, really I'm talking about southern or central and southern Appalachia, from southern Ohio on into North Carolina and northern Georgia, has more heirloom fruits, vegetables, grains, and heritage breeds of livestock than the rest of North America combined. It's richer in its food biodiversity, just like it's richer in wild biodiversity, as we know from the projects, the all-species, all-taxa inventory being done in the Great Smokies, than any other region in North America. And why there's all this heterogeneity in microenvironments, as well as this deep cultural history and continuity in cultures that have allowed both the wild habitats and the agricultural habitats to remain intact longer than any other place in the country. So we may think of like California because of Alice Waters and the strength of the local food movement being the place where you can get the most food diversity, and indeed it's about increased tenfold in the last 20 years. But most of that diversity in California is new to California, brought in by immigrants, very little time depth except for a few things like Sierra Beauty apples and abalone and Petaluma beans. In most cases, all of that's spanking new and sort of a globalized food biodiversity rather than a place-based one. You still have the place-based diversity here. I remember when I was in Michigan 2 summers ago, I saw a little cardboard sign on the side of a road near Lake Huron that said, "Got whitefish." That's all they had to say, and neighbors would, come in there, smoked whitefish or Cisco. That people would just flock to that, and you didn't really have to do much advertising because people had so much pride in those local foods. So when you look at this, the Great Lakes looks depauperate compared to Appalachia, but Appalachia's just off the charts. And there's still incredibly interesting food diversity here in the Great Lakes. And a number of those things are even being grown just to this, within reach of here in the Cuyahoga River Valley. Well, according to scientists as well as old-timers that know the oral history of this area, our access of these place-based foods is quickly disappearing here, as it is in many other parts of the world. And now we've done longitudinal surveys where we can go back to county fair records, perhaps, and then look what's being offered in the same county fairs today, and we're finding a tenth or 1/3 of the diversity that was once offered in these farmers markets and other fairs and other venues. And global weirding or climate change is just one of the many factors that's driving that loss of diversity and sort of the globalization or commodification of the food variety that we get. And I like the word that Thomas Friedman came up, global weirding, because warming alone doesn't describe what's happening to the planet. Some areas are getting colder, the extremes are getting more adverse. That means that this term that has kind of gotten in fashion in the food world of terroir, the taste of a place, is being scrambled. Terroir is not something that the Bordeaux wine in the Bordeaux region of France tasted exactly the same as it did 150 years ago when it first started to be described as Bordeaux wine, or that the tequila made in Jalisco tastes the same as it did when Jose Cuervo and the Sausa family began to make mezcal de tequila and bottle it for export in the 1890s. The weather has changed, the soils have been depleted, the landscape mosaic in these regions has changed, and we shouldn't expect the taste of food or beverage to remain constant if we've had that much dynamism in the very constituents that go into the food. So what's interesting about this term terroir that's getting a huge revival, a beautiful book by Amy Trubeck 2 years ago called The Taste of Place, and a new one out by Rowan Jacobson that I highly recommend called American Terroir, and I'll have one out called Desert Terroir in another year, is looking at how the taste of place is becoming an increasing way that farmers market their food as being distinctive, but yet at the same time terroir is imperiled or becoming more ambivalent. A little history on that term. Every culture had a concept equivalent to terroir, at least the cultures that I've asked, that they knew that the taste of the earth or the predominant vegetation in a food filtered in and onto your plate. So that my relatives on the Lebanon-Syria border, when I began talking to them about sheep herding, which I've done now in Arizona and that they do there, and I asked them about the taste of their lamb, is it due to particular kinds of breeds? They say, well, actually it's more due to where we feed them in the summer and the winter, that when they're up in the high pastures of the anti-Lebanon mountains, in the summer they have the taste of zatar, this wild thyme. Thank you. This is the taste of place right here in this glass. But that even terroir changes seasonally. But it's amazing that early scientists like this fellow 200 years ago said, place makes unique taste. And so the fundamental task of the agricultural scientist is to understand the nature of terroir. whether it's the land of your ancestors or the land recently acquired. And for those of us who are recent immigrants, to understand the taste of the land that we acquired, whether it's rented, given to us with free access like Jones Farm, or owned, I think is very important. It's you know, what Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson called meeting the expectations of the land, trying to learn from the land what it can produce. Yet it's a slippery term because it's what scientists might call a multifactorial experiment, that you can't define terroir by just a single factor, yet climate clearly determines how these other factors are expressed in it. And yet the more we went around North America, from nearly the Canadian border down into central Mexico, the more we realize that terroir is being scrambled and perhaps even imperiled by rapid climate change. And in particular, the major thing that may be affecting you here in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania is the change in the predominant temperature regimes that affect fruit production and quality. So the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a report 2 years ago that suggested that most of the apples grown in southern Pennsylvania, or in northern Pennsylvania, are now receiving below their threshold of winter chill hours, and that people will have to switch to the varieties now available in southern Pennsylvania if apple production is to survive in the north. And the same way all the way down, that the ones in southern Pennsylvania will have to be uprooted and other varieties planted that perhaps are now being grown in North Carolina and Georgia. In California, a friend of mine, Ike Ludelings, looked at the stone fruit growing area, the fruit basket of central California, where at the end of World War II, about 50% of the landscape was in stone fruits. Now, because of high summer temperatures that reduce the quality of grapes and certain stone fruits, and this loss of chill hours happening in the wintertime, only about 5% of that land gives the optimal conditions for fruit production, and by 2050 they think that all the fruit production will be gone from Central California. And so Greg Jones, this friend of mine at Southern Oregon University, says that this not only affects the nature of what we can be grown, but the culture of what we do as growers. That climate change is now altering long-held regional identities. If you're from Sonoma County in California and you've been to the Gravenstein Apple Festival there, and suddenly Gravenstein apples can't be grown there anymore for the first time since the Russians introduced them a couple centuries ago, this changes how you feel about your place in your community. So are these place-based vegetables and fruits and canaries in the coal mine of what may happen to the food biodiversity and then the food security of our whole system? And again, Greg Jones says that so many of the quality fruits that we most revere in this country grow in narrow climatic zones that are now put at risk by both the short-term variability in climate change that may be like El Nino, La Nina swings in climate, not just unidirectional global warming, that we may not have these high-quality fruit production zones for very long, and that the price of wine is an indicator of whether we're meeting optimal conditions. If some of these wines are too sweet and not enough taste, the market price goes down, and that's because for a high-end product like wine, people really care about the quality of it, and the prices reflect that. And that in general, beyond wine, we're seeing more and more desiccated fruit that are not only reaching full maturity, but aren't reaching full quality and flavor. So let's switch from those generalities to talking about the love of my life, the chili pepper. Okay, apologies to my wife wherever she is right now, but she's another kind of love of my life. But the chili peppers are lenses through which we can look at this change, because so many of the varieties grown in North America are specific to one particular place in the entire American landscape. And this is a map that just shows you some of those places. That big one is the wild chilies, the red hot mother of chilies that I've studied a lot on the Arizona-Sonora border. Many of you have seen the pictures of the long red strands of chili peppers in northern New Mexico. And there's about a dozen varieties of long green and red chilies up there. In fact, New Mexico is the only state in the country with an official state question, which is when you go for breakfast in the morning in a cafe, the waitress doesn't say, "Good morning" to you, she says, "Red or green?" And that's whether you want red chili sauce or green chili sauce on your eggs. Very important kind of question. Existential question. And then the Tabasco growing area in Louisiana, most of it that's been restricted to Avery Island. San Augustine, Florida for the datil pepper, the Spanish word datil, turned into dattle. And then up by Chesapeake Bay, the fish pepper that African American cooks took from the ornamental gardens of their slave owners and brought them back to the slave quarters and started to make incredible sauces with them that are now called piccalilli, and we think that's from the widespread African word for chilies, pili pili. And those came in at least 100, 150 years ago. And then the Beaver Dam pepper in Wisconsin, in an area near Madison, Wisconsin, that was brought in by Austrian and Hungarian immigrants, that is a wonderful thick skin stuffing pepper that's grown in the Midwest. The thing that we were surprised about is that the peak vulnerability in each of these production areas to damage of the crop actually happens right when the crop is maturing and the fruit are harvesting. This September 10th to say October 10th time when storms ravage the East Coast with hurricanes and tropical winds affect several of these areas, and yet it's the same time we're most vulnerable in the Southwest to storms. So if these storms had come in February, there wouldn't be much impact on peppers, obviously, but the peak maturation time and the time most critical to the abundance of harvest and to the prices is right when we get most of the storms. And we now see that we can't say global climate change is affecting the severity of storms but on a statistical basis, but it is affecting their frequency. And so we've had 8 landfalling hurricanes in Florida and the Gulf Coast in the last 8 years, and 5 other hurricanes causing devastating damage with winds, if not by floods, over the same period. And what we were most surprised to learn from farmers is that it's really not the immediate aftermath of the flood or the winds that really trip them up. It's the biotic interactions, the ecological, longer-term effects that come in with these hurricanes. So after Hurricane Gilberto hit the Yucatan Peninsula, it had sucked a lot of air off the coast of Africa in making its cyclonic swing, and it brought 6 viruses never known in the Americas before into the Yucatan Peninsula and then into Florida that none of the chilies had resistance to. Weeds are being carried hundreds of miles and establishing and then quickly affecting areas that they've never been affected, that have never been affected by them before. There's a new stink bug in Virginia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania that damaged 40% of the fruit crop last year of peaches and apples, and had never been seen in that area more than 2 years ago. Okay, and now it's the major pest in orchards in Virginia. I was just in Virginia, and it was like windrows of this lousy little stink bug. No one knows even where it came from. They're still trying to identify it. And so insects, diseases, and weeds that we've never seen make long-term effects on the health and sustainability of these food systems. And so this is the kind of recording of just a decade of storms. And if we do this next decade from 205 to 215, we may see this look like some crazy scribble that a ADD 5-year-old might make all over a map, because there's so many storms happening in trajectories where we haven't seen them. And as you can see, many of these are touching down on the coast where these rarest of the rare heirloom peppers are from. Okay, let's talk about the human face of climate change, because that's what we were really after in this book. First of all, farmers even 100 miles away from one another are really affected by these things differently, as are wild foragers. And this slide is about the forages, the next one about farmers in the same place. So in about a 300-mile stretch, we found drought and larval infestations causing complete crop failure of chilies. And then a hurricane hit in the mid-zone where these wild chilies are commercially harvested, about 50 tons of them, and scoured all the plants out of the system. And I'll talk about those floods in a second. And then just south of there where the Yaqui Indian people live, they got just enough rain to give them the best prices they've ever had, because they were the only ones that had chilies, but not enough to flood out their chilies. So now chilies are going for about $75 a pound. If you could grow them in a field and get the same yield that you get off these wild plants, you can make more money off an acre of wild chilies than you could off marijuana. So those of you who need to change your crop repertoire for legal purposes, please consider this. So then we had this thing where, as we were passing through this area that had just had a hurricane, we slammed to a halt because we saw whole orchards with all the trees knocked down. And 2.5 times the average annual rainfall had fallen in about a 30-hour period. 2.5 times the average annual rainfall. Now this is beyond the 99th percentile of probability, I think. This is like a 1,000-year flood. We can't say again that this is climate change. There are, floods and storms like this come around, but absolutely devastating effects. Human effects. The man there without a shirt on lost his shirt. He lost every machine on his farm. He lost 20% of his trees. He lost all the houses for his farm worker. Water came through his adobe house at the 8-foot level. The tree behind him was where he lived for 16 hours above 10 feet in its spindly branches, hanging on for dear life while the water went under him 8 feet deep. And I talked to him 3 weeks after this storm, and it was post-traumatic stress. He could not start to talk about this without crying and shaking. He could not get more than 3 sentences in where he either had to stop and pray or start to cry. And so we think about climate change in this antiseptic way with kind of the graphs crap that I showed you a couple slides back. This is the human face of climate change that the graphs don't tell. Weirdly, we may think we're buffered from this in urban areas, but urban environments and urban farms are the harbingers of what we'll have to do with climate change. Because in terms of warming, they're warming far more rapidly than the surrounding environment. So in Phoenix, where I lived for a while, we've had a 10-degree Fahrenheit increase in nighttime summer temperatures since World War II. 10 degrees. It's hotter than sin there. It's so hot that people can't sin. They can't go out at night in the summer. It's just so unbelievably hot because we have all this asphalt, all these rooftops that are just making more heat accumulate in the environment. And so we really need to pay special attention to what is happening with climate change in cities and how that's affecting what people can and can't grow. And the sad thing is that the cities have become more important in ways because we've done such a lousy job of dealing with maintaining our farmland in the peri-urban fringe and beyond. So in particular in the Southwest where I live, we've lost 1/4 of all the farmland in the country just between California and Texas. One of the few places that we can do year-round production without hoop houses. We've lost over 6 million acres of farmland since 1982. So we're losing the whole capacity to grow foods, almost independent of climate change, but these things have this insidious synergy in some ways. And I think that's why when we're losing that capacity in our rural areas and our peri-urban areas, that urban farms become more important. And I'm just so excited what's happening in Cleveland and Detroit and Milwaukee with urban farms. We have 50 new urban farms in Tucson, Phoenix, and Albuquerque. And Forbes magazine recently predicted that 1 in every 5 meals that will be eaten in another 7 years in this country will come from places that are right now rooftops and vacant lots. And people, it will be so costly as fossil fuel prices begin to rise to import food from California or from Florida that we'll have to grow it in urban areas. And that will be converting parking lots to the tune of $70,000 to $150,000 back to the fertile fields that are buried under them to have access to food. That local food will not be a luxury for foodies. It will be a necessity if we want affordable food. To do this kind of shift, we need you as co-designers of new systems of food production and consumption. So one little project we have is mobile food wagons, including mobile farmers markets that go around to elderly homes, nursing homes, low-income areas where people don't even have cars, and bring fresh local food to them rather than thinking that everyone can go across town to the closest farmers market. So we're having local artists design one of these mobile food wagons as we speak. One is already activated in Indian reservations in New Mexico, and it's basically bringing healthy, affordable foods to people who are either handicapped and can't get out to farmers markets or don't have a car. And I really mean that the kind of art students and people interested in architecture, participatory design, not just people interested in sustainable ag, have to be part of this. Wow, is that raining down? That's pretty exciting. Can I FedEx some of this home? We only had a 1/4 inch of rain between September 15th and May 15th, so I'm looking to take some of it home. The trouble with coming here is that they ask when you come to a campus like this, do you have any food restrictions? And I eat just about anything, but what I really need when I come to a place like Oberlin is like a box full of kitty litter that I can do dust bath in the evening. It's just way too wet for me. So, the question that we know that it's affecting crops, and we may think of them as specialty crops like peppers are in a way, they're condiments, they're not staples. But is this affecting food security? Or will it affect food security? And the answer is it already has. So let me just tell you about 2 climatic catastrophes. And again, we can't say this is unidirectional climate change. But I think it's the kind of thing that we're going to see more and more frequently as the more aberrant weather events restructure our whole food system. In 45 minutes, my neighbors lost $2 million of grape production that translates to about $10 to $20 million of wine production. 45 minutes. A hailstorm that was only 2 miles wide and 8 miles long did that much damage, stripping every grape leaf off the vineyards. And there's one apple orchard in the midst of those vineyards with 120 varieties, stripped every leaf and apple off the trees in 45 minutes. September 1, that apple orchard bloomed again. It thought it had just gone through winter and was trying to start over again. Really weird. Really weird to see apple trees bloom in September. February 3rd and 4th this year, and I just had an article on this on the Atlantic Monthly website. A day-long freeze from one night to the next, about 25 to 30 hours really, caused damage to the 80% of the winter vegetables that all of the U.S. gets from the west coast of Mexico and the southernmost counties in California and Arizona, Imperial County and Yuma County. And overnight, the price of tomatoes, vegetables, cucumbers, and eggplants went up sevenfold. Sevenfold within a week. And Denny's and other food chain franchises said, no tomatoes in salads, no tomatoes on hamburgers. If you want something else on it, we'll try to give it to you, but we don't have them. This is across the whole country. And so the demand for these was enormous. The few people that made it through this because they had greenhouse production made a killing. But the low estimates are that 3,500 farm workers were immediately put out of work for the whole season. Fortunately, farmers are not passive victims of climate change. We don't need any more, we're all victims of things beyond our control. They're active participants. They're astute observers of weather. Many farmers would rather talk about weather than anything else. But because of that, they're really good at pattern recognition, and they're also pretty good about thinking some things that they can do, like changing the orientation of their grapevine rows or fruit tree rows may help. Increasing the moisture holding capacity of their soils, like many permacultural techniques do, many biological and natural agricultural techniques encourage us to do. If you can increase the water holding capacity of your soils 50-fold, like Fred Kirschman says you can do, then you're buffered from a deviation in rainfall of maybe 4 inches one way or the other. It may not give you production in a year of tremendous drought, but you can do a lot to buffer yourself from the variations in rainfall if you just increase your moisture holding capacity. And then farmers are doing these really interesting things of planting crops that they used to plant in open sun, under shade, because things like chilies only need about 40% of the ambient sunlight that they receive over a day's time. So they can be under a tree that buffers them both from extreme heat and extreme cold late in the season. The other thing is that we can work on the drivers of climate change, like many of you are engaged in, that if 46% of the Americans' carbon footprint is our food print, according to my favorite website that I just forgot, Redefining Progress. If that's true, by making the food print of our food system much smaller, we can reduce the acceleration of climate change. And by some calculations, the post-harvest energy use in our food system is almost a quarter of all our energy use in bringing food from seedling to table. And so it's not just what happens on the farm. All of us are engaged in that, whether we drive 20 miles to a grocery store because we live in a food desert, or whether we're buying high-energy food drinks that have plants from 5 continents in a single bottle. We can reduce our food print. So ultimately, each of us must decide what kind of food print we want. Eating is one of the most direct ways we impact the planet, period. Of all the many things that we can do to reduce the impact of climate change, what we choose to eat and what we choose not to eat is one of the most direct daily observances we can do. And it surprises me that a lot of places the sustainability movement is stuck just on transportation and green buildings alone, and not working with equal diligence on the food system, because it's just as important as those other factors. So what can be done in particular to, quote, protect or at least dynamically adapt our place-based foods? We can engage communities of producers and processors in setting up early alerts to these kind of climatic catastrophic events, and employ bed hedging strategies to buffer ourselves from them, like increasing water holding capacity. We can consider assisted migration of some of these heirlooms, like the apples in southern Pennsylvania, that we may need to move up to northern Pennsylvania because their apples may not make it anymore. Move those ones up to Ontario. We can build communities of support among urban consumers and gardeners with food producers. Each time each of us is involved in growing some of our food, I think we have more empathy with food producers in other places, in other cultures, and other classes. And finally, we can eat the foods that are threatened and endangered now. It's sort of the opposite. You know, you wouldn't tell someone to eat a panda or a condor, but with endangered foods, if there's no market for them, they will be culled out. So this is one of the places where eat it to save it makes sense. My friend Poppy Tucker in New Orleans, her grandmother told her that, said, "Poppy, honey, if you want it on the table, you better eat it, or I'm going to stop making it and I'm going to stop buying it." So every time with cultivated plants, unlike wild plants, that we choose to vote with our grocery bags and garden tools and bellies for these kinds of foods to be part of our lives, we're actually performing a modest act of conservation. So we're not just stopping with this book. The gastronauts are planning other episodes. We're thinking of doing this, looking at chili production around the world, and we have this new project on the sustainable food systems, food and water security in the borderland states. And if any of you are looking for future internships or anything like that, consider coming down to the stinking hot desert and working with us on border food security issues. I want to leave you with a poem prayer of sorts called the Terroirist Manifesto for Eating in Place, and then we can have some questions. Know where your food comes from through knowing those who produced it for you, from farmer to forager, rancher or fisher, to earthworms building a deeper, richer soil, to the heirloom vegetable, the nitrogen-fixing legume, the pollinator, the heritage breed of livestock, or the sourdough culture rising in your flour. Know where your food comes from by the very way that it tastes, its freshness telling you how far it may have traveled, the hint of mint in the cheese suggesting what the goat has eaten, the terroir of the wine reminding you of the lime and the stone that you stand upon, so that you can stand up for the very land that has given it to you. Know where your food comes from by the richness of stories told around the table, recalling all that was harvested nearby during the years that came before you, when your ancestors and your predecessors roamed the same woods and the same neighborhoods where you and yours now roam. Know them by the songs sung to praise them, by the handmade tools kept to harvest them, by the rites and feasts held to celebrate them, by the laughter let loose to show them our affection. Know where your food comes from by the patience displayed while putting them up, while peeling, skinning, coring, or gutting them, while canning, salting, or smoking them, while arranging them on the plate for our eyes to behold. Know where your food comes from by the slow, savoring of each and every morsel. By letting their fragrances lodge in your memory, reminding you of just exactly where you were the very day that you became blessed by each of their distinctive flavors. Now, when you know where your food comes from, you can give something back to those lands and those waters, that rural culture, that migrant harvester, curer, smoker, poacher, roaster, or vintner. You can give something back to that soil, something fecund and fleeting like compost, or something lasting and legal like protection. We as humans have not been given roots as obvious as those of plants. The surest way that we have to lodge ourselves within this blessed earth is by knowing where our food comes from. Thank you.